New York, late 1964. A sealed negotiation room inside Columbia Records. The producer's voice is flat, exhausted, sharpened by years of quiet control. He doesn't raise it. That's why it cuts. You really think your lyrics are new? A pause. Papers shift. Kid, you're just another folk singer who started believing his own myth. Silence. Bob Dylan doesn't argue. His fingers crush a page of fresh verses until the paper bends with him. He's 23. The press calls him a voice of a generation. But across the table sits a man who can erase that voice without raising a hand. The air tightens. Then the door opens. No announcement. No permission. This man was never scheduled to be here. He doesn't work for Columbia. He doesn't belong in this room. The silence thickens, almost physical. Someone whispers, unsure they should, "Elvis?" He hasn't spoken yet. But the moment he does, the balance of the room will shift. And nothing said here will ever be taken back. Let us know where you're watching from. And we hope you enjoy the story. The room was designed to make people speak carefully. Low ceiling, thick carpet that swallowed footsteps, walls covered in muted wood panels that held the echo just long enough for every pause to feel intentional. On the table lay neatly stacked folders, each labeled in thin black type, as if order itself were part of the negotiation. Bob Dylan sat slightly back in his chair, shoulders angled away from the table. Not defensive, just unconsciously distant. His jacket hung loose, the collar of his shirt half folded, as though he'd dressed quickly and never quite caught up with himself. A legal pad rested in front of him, untouched. The pen lay parallel to its edge. Someone had placed it there for him. Across the table, the producer spoke without raising his voice. Mid-40s, precise haircut, hands always folded, as if applause were beneath him. He didn't look at Dylan directly when he spoke. He addressed the idea of Dylan instead. "You understand," he said gently, "that the audience doesn't follow complexity forever. They attach to something familiar. A tone, a posture, an image." Paper shifted. A page was turned, deliberately slow. "What you've built," the man continued, "it works because people believe they understand you. We don't want to lose that." Dylan nodded once, barely. His eyes stayed on the table grain, tracing a dark knot in the wood. He had heard louder criticism from strangers, harsher words shouted from the back of clubs. But this was different. This was quiet, professional. It didn't accuse. It reframed. Another pause. The producer smiled, almost apologetically. "Poetry is important," he said. "But records aren't read. They're consumed." The word lingered. Dylan's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. No argument rose to his mouth. What surfaced instead was doubt. Thin, unwelcome. He thought of the new songs folded in his coat pocket. Verses that didn't explain themselves. Choruses that refused to settle. He had written them because he couldn't not write them. The producer leaned forward slightly now, sensing the opening. "We're not asking you to change who you are," he said, "just to translate it. Make it clearer, shorter lines, less ambiguity. Give people something to hold on to." A faint chuckle followed, practiced. "Styles move fast. You don't want to be remembered as a moment." That landed harder than any insult. A moment. Something already passing. Dylan finally looked up. Not at the producer's eyes, but at the reflection in the polished surface of the table. His own face, distorted slightly. Unfamiliar. For the first time that afternoon, he wondered whether the room was right. Whether the words he carried were already being measured for disposal. He said nothing. The producer took that silence as agreement, or weakness. It was hard to tell which men like him preferred. Elvis had been awake since before dawn, not because he needed to be, but because sleep didn't hold him the way it used to. The hotel curtains in Manhattan leaked a gray winter light at the edges, and the city sounded busy even when it wasn't loud. Radiators clicking, distant horns, the hush of an elevator somewhere down the hall. On the chair by the window sat a script he hadn't opened. Another smiling scene, another clean ending. The kind of story that paid well and left nothing behind inside you. He dressed slowly, as if each button were a small decision. When the collar settled against his neck, he felt the familiar squeeze of a life that looked bigger from the outside than it did from where he stood. A portable record player sat on the dresser. Someone from RCA had mailed over things he should hear, neat suggestions from people who spoke about music like a product line. Elvis had ignored most of it, but in the pile was a Columbia pressing, Dylan. Rough voice, sharp edges, words that didn't ask permission. He'd listened the night before with the volume low, like it was something private. Not because he was ashamed, but because it felt dangerous to admit how much it mattered. Dylan didn't sound polished. He sounded free. Elvis recognized that kind of freedom the way a thirsty man recognizes water. By late morning, he was across town for a separate meeting. Nothing dramatic, just the usual handshake talk with people who treated his name like a key. In a hallway outside an office, he overheard two men speaking with the casual cruelty of those who think no one important is listening. "Columbia's got Dylan in there," one said, amused. "They're trying to save him from himself." The other laughed. "Good luck. The kid wants to plug in and ruin his own market." Elvis stopped walking. Not as a star making an entrance, just as a man catching a phrase that sounded too familiar. Save him from himself. He'd heard that line, or something close to it, in different rooms, different years. It always meant the same thing. Obey, or we'll do it for you. He asked quietly, "Which room?" The men turned, startled. Their faces changed the moment they recognized him, respect rushing in too late, like a coat thrown over a stain. One of them pointed down the corridor. "Third floor, end of the hall." Elvis nodded and moved before he could talk himself out of it. On the elevator up, his hands stayed still, but his thoughts didn't. He hated meddling. He knew what it felt like to have strangers decide they understood you better than you did. He'd spent years smiling through it, telling himself it was the price. Yet Dylan's voice from the record player kept returning, those stubborn lines that refused to be cleaned up. At the end of the hall, the Columbia door was shut. No guards, no crowd. Just a thin strip of light beneath it and the faint murmur of controlled conversation. Elvis hesitated. He could walk away, and no one would ever know. That was the easiest kind of courage, silent and invisible. Then he heard it through the wood, clear enough to sting. "People don't buy meaning," a man inside was saying. "They buy something they recognize." Elvis's jaw tightened. He'd been called a product with a pulse. He'd been advised to keep it simple, keep it safe, keep it profitable. He'd watched men in suits turn art into permission slips. His fingers hovered near the handle. He wasn't thinking about being Elvis Presley in that moment. He was thinking about a younger version of himself, standing in a different office, hearing the same smooth warnings. And before the doubt could return, he pushed the door open. The door didn't slam. It opened with a controlled, almost polite sound, the kind that usually meant an assistant arriving late. But no one announced a name. No apology followed. The room simply shifted, as if its balance had been disturbed. Elvis stepped inside alone. No entourage, no jacket slung over an arm. His presence didn't demand attention. It absorbed it. The producer froze mid-motion. a sentence still forming but never completed. Dylan's head lifted instinctively, eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second, as if bracing for another version of the same argument. Then recognition set in. Not awe, but surprise edged with caution. Elvis closed the door behind him and didn't immediately move toward the table. He stayed where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, surveying the room like someone trying to understand a place they hadn't been invited into. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, voice low, unhurried. "But I heard something in the hallway that sounded familiar." The producer recovered quickly. A professional smile returned, thinner now, stretched across calculation. "Mr. Presley," he said, standing halfway before sitting again. "We weren't expecting—" "I know," Elvis replied gently. He finally took a step forward, stopping short of the table. "That's why I won't stay long." Dylan watched silently. Elvis didn't look at him yet. That alone felt unusual. Most people couldn't help themselves. Elvis turned his attention back to the producer. "I've got a question," he said. "When was the last time you let an artist make you uncomfortable?" The words weren't sharp. They were careful. That made them harder to deflect. The producer blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." Elvis nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "I mean this," he continued. "Every time someone walks into a room like this with something new, someone else decides it needs to be explained before it's allowed to exist. Why is that?" Silence gathered. The air felt denser, like it had been pressed flat. "This is a business," the producer said at last. "We protect artists by guiding them." Elvis tilted his head slightly. "Or you protect the system by sanding them down." That did it. The smile disappeared. Not anger. Confusion. The producer wasn't used to being challenged by someone he couldn't dismiss. Dylan shifted in his chair. For the first time, he looked directly at Elvis. Not as a legend, not as an icon, but as someone who had walked into the same kind of trap and somehow lived inside it. Elvis finally met Dylan's eyes. Just for a moment. There was no praise there, no reassurance, only recognition. "I'm not here to defend him," Elvis said, returning his gaze to the table. "He doesn't need that. But I've been told my whole life that people don't want to be challenged. Funny thing is, they never seem to say that part out loud." The producer's hands folded again, tighter this time. "With respect, this conversation is exactly the conversation," Elvis interrupted softly. The room no longer belonged to contracts or schedules. Something had shifted. Not because voices were raised, but because control had been named. Dylan felt it then. Not relief, not victory, but the first hint that he wasn't alone in the unease he'd been carrying. He straightened slightly, as if remembering his spine. The producer glanced between them, calculating outcomes that hadn't existed minutes earlier. No one spoke. And in that silence, it became clear the meeting was no longer moving toward a neat resolution. It was moving toward a reckoning. The producer didn't respond right away. He leaned back instead, allowing the chair to creak just enough to reclaim authority through calm. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Not colder, but smoother, like a man switching tools. "Let's slow this down," he said evenly. "No one here is trying to erase anyone." He spread his hands, palms up, a gesture rehearsed through years of difficult rooms. "Bob's record will come out. That was never in question. We simply want it to reach people without unnecessary resistance." Elvis didn't react. He watched, attentive but unreadable, as if listening to a story he already knew the ending to. The producer slid a thin folder across the table toward Dylan. Not forcefully, not timidly. It stopped inches from the untouched legal pad. "Minor adjustments," he continued. "A verse here, a line there. Nothing that alters the core, just removes the sharpest edges. Radio doesn't forgive confusion. Dylan stared at the folder. He didn't open it. The room waited for him to do so, like a held breath. Elvis finally spoke. "You call it compromise," he said. "But compromise means both sides walk away lighter. Right now, only one person's being asked to leave something behind." The producer met his gaze. "With respect, Mr. Presley, influence works both ways. Your presence here already complicates things." The implication wasn't hidden. Doors opened because of Elvis. They could close, too. Elvis absorbed that without flinching. "I'm aware," he said quietly. Dylan shifted again. His silence now felt different, longer, heavier. He imagined the album released with safer words, reviewers nodding politely, crowds clapping without listening. He imagined explaining himself for the rest of his career. The producer leaned forward, voice lowered, almost confidential. "This isn't about fear," he said. "It's about longevity. Not every door needs to be kicked open." Dylan's jaw tightened. He felt the temptation to agree, to nod, and survive. The offer was real. So was the cost. Elvis glanced at him, then back to the producer. "Some doors only open once," he said, "and some close forever if you don't walk through them when they matter." The room grew tense, not loud. No one raised a voice. But the stakes sharpened, suddenly visible. The producer closed the folder, decisive. "Think carefully," he said, directing the words at both of them now. "Not everyone gets second chances in this business." Elvis didn't respond. Dylan didn't either. What had begun as a quiet negotiation had become something riskier. Not an argument, but a test. And it was clear now. Whatever happened next would follow them far beyond this room. The phone on the producer's desk rang once, sharp and intrusive. He glanced at it, then at the two men across the table, measuring the temperature of the room as if it were a market shift. "Give me a minute," he said, already standing. "This won't take long." The door closed behind him with a muted click. Not a dramatic exit. Just absence. What remained felt exposed. The hum of the building came forward. Pipes, distant typewriters, a muffled laugh somewhere far down the hall. Dylan realized his foot had been tapping. He stopped it, embarrassed by the small betrayal of nerves. Elvis exhaled slowly, like someone setting down weight he'd been carrying in his chest. He moved closer to the table but didn't sit. "You don't owe me anything," he said, not looking at Dylan. "I'm not here to tell you what to do." Dylan nodded once. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Feels like everyone else already has." Elvis let that sit. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the public one, not the practiced curve. Something tired, almost regretful. "I said yes to things I shouldn't have," he admitted. "Not because I believed in them, because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't." He rested his hand on the back of the chair opposite Dylan, knuckles pale. "You start telling yourself it's temporary, that you'll fix it later. Funny thing is, later keeps moving." Dylan listened without interrupting. No idol stood before him now. Just a man older enough to know where the road bends. "I thought control meant safety," Elvis continued. "Turns out it just teaches people how far they can push you." Dylan reached into his coat and pulled out one of the marked pages from the folder. He studied the red pencil lines. Suggestions, they'd called them. Clarifications. He didn't tear it right away. He folded it once, then again, carefully. When he finally ripped it, the sound was small, almost apologetic. He placed the pieces on the table. Elvis watched, expression unreadable. "If you walk away," Elvis said after a moment, "they'll call you difficult, ungrateful, maybe worse." Dylan didn't look up. "And if I stay?" Elvis's voice dropped. "You'll learn to hate your own songs." The words weren't advice. They were confession. The door handle turned. Both men straightened instinctively. Not allies, not conspirators. Just two people returning to their places, knowing something irreversible had already passed between them. Whatever came next would not undo it. The producer returned with the same measured stride, but his eyes went first to the table. He noticed the torn paper immediately. He didn't ask about it. Men like him rarely asked questions when the answer was already inconvenient. He sat down, slower than before, and folded his hands. The room felt smaller now, as if its walls had inched closer during his absence. "I see," he said calmly. Not to Elvis. To Dylan. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dylan straightened in his chair, not abruptly, not defiantly. Just enough to change the angle of his shoulders. When he finally raised his head, his voice carried a steadiness that hadn't been there earlier. "I'm not going to explain my songs," he said, "not to people who are afraid to print them." The words landed without flourish. No raised tone, no speech. Just a line drawn and quietly defended. The producer studied him as if seeing a different person than the one who'd walked in. "Then we don't have much left to discuss," he replied. "Columbia can't move forward under those conditions." He reached for the folder and closed it with finality. "That's unfortunate," he added. Not cruelly. Almost sympathetically. Dylan didn't respond. He already knew what had been lost. What surprised him was the absence of panic. Elvis stood then, not dramatically, just enough to signal the end of his role in the room. He looked at the producer, his expression unreadable, voice level. "You just passed on what's coming next," he said, "and you won't even recognize it when it arrives." The producer didn't rise to that. He smiled faintly, the way men do when they believe time is on their side. "History tends to agree with those who last," he said. Elvis nodded once. "It also has a habit of embarrassing certainty." No one argued. Dylan stood, gathering nothing. No papers, no pen. The legal pad remained untouched on the table, as if it had never belonged to him. He walked to the door, paused, then left without looking back. Elvis lingered a second longer. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not triumph, not satisfaction. More like recognition of a familiar loss. Then he turned and followed. The door closed. Inside the room, nothing appeared broken. The chairs remained aligned. The table was clean. Only the torn paper, still lying where it had been placed, suggested that anything irreversible had happened at all. Outside, neither man spoke. Both understood the same truth. The right decision rarely feels like a victory when it's made, and the consequences were only beginning. The silence that followed the meeting was louder than anything said inside that room. Dylan vanished first. No statements, no explanations. Scheduled appearances quietly canceled, interviews postponed without new dates. To the outside world it looked like retreat. The papers filled the gap eagerly. Unstable. Overestimated. Burned out too fast. The phrases repeated until they began to sound like facts. In a rented house far from Manhattan noise, Dylan worked without witnesses. The songs changed shape. They grew sharper, less patient. He stopped trying to meet anyone halfway. There was no audience in the room now, no producer's chair to angle away from. Only the sound of an amplifier humming softly, waiting. Elvis returned west and stepped back onto a film set that looked louder than it felt. Painted storefronts, artificial skies, crew members who smiled easily and asked nothing dangerous of him. The script pages were light in his hands, too light. Between takes he sat alone in his trailer, door half closed, listening to nothing. The words he'd spoken in that Columbia room came back to him uninvited. If you stay, you'll learn to hate your own songs. He realized with a quiet discomfort that he already knew exactly what that felt like. At night, he asked for records, not singles, not charts, lyrics, typed pages, handwritten drafts. His circle noticed the shift, but didn't comment. They were used to phases. This one felt different, quieter, more deliberate. One afternoon in the studio, a musician laughed lightly and said, "You trying to turn into Dylan now?" Elvis didn't answer. He adjusted the session schedule instead, pushed the work later into the night, trimmed the polished edges. No announcement, no rebellion, just small refusals stacked carefully on top of each other. Meanwhile, Dylan resurfaced only enough to be heard. New songs appeared, electric, abrasive, unwilling to explain themselves. Audiences split. Applause collided with boos. The noise followed him from city to city, but he didn't correct anyone. He played louder. Neither man reached out to the other. They didn't need to. The line between them, held without contact, stretched tight across distance and time. What the world called absence was preparation. Something irreversible had already been set in motion, though no one could yet name it. Not the press, not the industry, not even the men themselves. They only felt it, the pressure building quietly, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally break. The noise came first. Not applause, argument. Dylan's return didn't arrive gently. Guitars screamed where acoustic strings once murmured. Words no longer reached for understanding. They demanded endurance. On stage, he didn't explain the change. He let it happen to people. Some stood frozen, betrayed. Others leaned forward, electrified. The songs didn't ask permission to exist anymore. Backstage, promoters argued in whispers. Longtime fans walked out early. Reviews split cleanly down the middle, as if the country itself couldn't agree on what it was hearing. Dylan read none of it. Each night, he stepped into the glare knowing exactly what waited for him, and refusing to soften the impact. Across the country, Elvis stood in a studio that felt unfamiliar, despite the familiar walls. This wasn't the clean, efficient machine he'd grown used to. He'd insisted on fewer takes, raw sound, less distance between voice and microphone. The engineers exchanged looks. This wasn't how things were done anymore. "I want it closer," Elvis said, adjusting his position. "I want it to sound like I'm still in the room with myself." A producer cleared his throat. "That's risky." Elvis nodded. "So is disappearing." The argument that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Contracts were mentioned, expectations, the careful architecture that had kept him successful. Elvis listened, then spoke with a calm that surprised even him. "Either I sing it the way it feels," he said, "or I don't sing at all." The room went quiet. Somewhere between takes, he thought of that office in New York. The torn paper on the table. The way Dylan hadn't looked back. He hadn't known then that he was rehearsing his own refusal. Neither man saw the other's struggle. They didn't need to. Their paths ran parallel now, separate roads shaped by the same choice. Both paid for it. Dylan lost part of his audience. Elvis risked the structure that had protected him for years. No victory followed. No relief. Only the strange steadiness that comes when pretense finally gives way. Music spoke where words had failed. And it told the truth without asking who was ready to hear it. Years later, the question came quietly, almost as an afterthought. The interview had already ended. The tape reels were slowing, their soft mechanical sigh filling the space between words. The journalist, younger than the songs he'd grown up with, hesitated before speaking again. aware that this part wouldn't be printed unless it mattered. Was there ever, he asked carefully, a moment when another artist changed how you dealt with the industry? Dylan didn't answer right away. He stared past the lights, past the chair opposite him, toward something that wasn't in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was neutral, almost dismissive. "People help each other all the time," he said. "Most of it doesn't make the story." The recorder clicked off. What didn't make it into print traveled differently. In fragments. In memory. In the way musicians spoke to each other late at night, when no one was performing. Those who had been around long enough told it without dates or names. Just that, once, when the pressure was quiet and dangerous, someone with everything to lose chose not to look away. Not because it would be noticed, but because it was necessary. Elvis never corrected the story. He never confirmed it either. When asked about influence, he spoke in general terms, about listening more, about regret, about learning too late that silence could be louder than refusal. In private, the tone changed. "I wasn't trying to save anyone," he once said, years on, sitting in a dim room where music played low and uninterrupted. "I just didn't want another kid waking up one day realizing he agreed to things that cost him himself." There was no pride in the admission, only weariness, and something like relief. By then, the consequences were clear. Dylan's path had reshaped expectations. Elvis's return had rewritten his own. Neither outcome traced cleanly back to that single room, but both carried its imprint. History would later prefer the bigger moments, the concerts, the comebacks, the headlines. It always did. What it rarely lingered on was the smaller act, the presence of one person in the wrong place at the exact right time. No cameras, no witnesses who mattered, just a door opening when it would have been easier to keep walking. That was the part that endured, not as legend, not as triumph, but as proof that sometimes the most lasting changes begin when someone refuses to stay silent in a room that expects obedience, and leaves without knowing who, exactly, has been saved.